To the subject matter of the conversation that we're going to have this evening. My name is Lee Tivell. I'm the executive director here at the Potter's House, and we are really thrilled to have all of you here, along with Stuart and Ori. Before I turn it over to Stuart and Ori, a few words about the Potter's House. How many of you are here for the first time tonight? Okay, a few. Welcome. And for the rest of you, welcome back. We're really glad you're here. Some of you may or may not know that we are actually a nonprofit social enterprise. We have been part of the Adams Morgan community since 1960, coming up on 60 years of hospitality and service to this community. Yeah. We have always been a hub for conversation, for action and activism, for creative expression and community transformation. And we do our best to live every day into our values of solidarity, justice, spirituality, and care for the earth. If you are interested in learning more about our other book talks and open mics and other fun stuff that we do here, go to pottershousedc.org/contact and sign up for our mailing list. So, this evening, we are so pleased to have Stuart and Ori here. As you know, or you may know, Stuart is lecturer and assistant research scientist in sociology, which is my major, at Johns Hopkins University, teaching courses in Africana Studies, International Studies, Political Science, and Sociology. He's also Associate Director of the Program in Racism, Immigration, and Citizenship at Johns Hopkins. He is, of course, also the author of Badges Without Borders, How Global Counterinsurgency Transformed American Policing. This book pulls back the curtain on the ways in which the United States has projected imperial power overseas through police training and technical assistance, and how those actions reverberated to shape the policing of city streets here at home. This is an examination of the very deep and very intentional relationships between militarization overseas and domestic policing, and what that means for us today. Joining Stuart as an interlocutor is Ori Burton, assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology at American University. Ori's work is fascinating. It focuses on the deep and layered relationships between grassroots movements and state repression. And specifically, his recent work explores the collision, I love that word, of Black-led movements for social, political, and economic transformation with state infrastructures of militarized policing, surveillance, and imprisonment. These are complicated, complex, often challenging conversations. And here at the Potter's House, those are the kind that we like the best. And as I said earlier, solidarity and justice are two of our core pillars here, so tonight's conversation lands squarely in that space. At the end of the talk, Stuart will have his book available for sale, so I hope that you'll take advantage of the opportunity to pick up a copy and dig more deeply into this important conversation. So to all of you, welcome to the Potter's House, and to Stuart and Ori, thank you so much for being here tonight.
Thank you for such a gracious introduction. Really excited to be here with you, Stuart. And thank you all for coming. So we're going to have a bit of a conversation, and then we'll open it up in the last 30 minutes for questions. So please write your questions down, and so let's get right into it. I wanted to start, Stuart, by asking you to talk a little bit about the framing of this book, to give like an overview for folks who might not have read it, and to give us an outline of the general parameters.
Sure. Thanks so much, Ori, and thanks to all of you. It's great to see a lot of faces I recognize, as well as faces I don't recognize. So it's really great to be here. Potter's House is an amazing space. I'm glad that y'all turned out for this event. So, Badges Without Borders tries to understand what the relationship is between the rise of the carceral state in the United States and the efforts by the United States to sort of improve and expand the security capacities of other countries during the Cold War, predominantly in the Third World. So the United States gave police technical assistance to 52 countries around the globe from the 1950s into the mid-1970s. And many of the people who were involved in this program of technical assistance and training for police in the Third World were kind of the leading figures of policing in the United States. So one of the kind of main arguments that I make in the book is that we should not think of the kind of personnel and institutions that projected US power globally as separate from the personnel and institutions who were dedicated to and entrusted with maintaining law and order domestically in the United States. So I do a kind of very intricate mapping of who these people are, what did they do, where did they go, what did they do when they ended up in the places they went across borders, and then what did they do when they came back home, what did they bring with them, what sorts of new ideas about training, what sorts of new technologies did they bring and develop, and what sort of kind of ideological and conceptual tools did they bring to bear on their experience both overseas and domestically. So that's kind of a few sentences of an overview.
Yeah, thank you. You really framed the book within the context of what you call Cold War civil rights, which is sort of the domestic analog to global decolonization. And so I wonder if you can talk a little bit, and first tell us what the Cold War civil rights framework is, and then talk a little bit about how that shaped and constrained the political project of police assistance.
Sure. So Cold War civil rights is a concept that comes from a number of historians, most prominently Mary Dudzik. And the argument is basically that during the Cold War, the United States was kind of looking around the globe and realizing that in the countries in the darker nations, to use Du Bois's term, the darker nations, their allegiance to the United States was not guaranteed. And this is after the end of World War II, the European empires are falling apart, they're collapsing through both their kind of internal contradictions and because of movements for decolonization, for independence, nationalist movements. And the United States is kind of looking around and saying, okay, our number one strategic goal is to make sure that these new nations do not become communist, that they don't align themselves with Moscow, they don't align themselves with Beijing, eventually after the Cuban Revolution with Havana. So how are we going to assure that they don't, basically declare themselves to be kind of enemies of the United States, or at least even non-aligned with the United States? Non-aligned was a term that was used a lot. In the United States, a set of diplomats say, well, one of the chief impediments to getting these darker nations to align with the United States is that the United States has this deep and very visible problem around racism in the United States. This is at the kind of outset of the civil rights movement which really gained steam in the 1950s into the 60s. And so there are State Department diplomats who are saying, okay, look, within the United States need to improve our record on civil rights and alleviate some of the racial oppression that's going on, because it will play better across the globe. It will help the image of the United States. So this is kind of a standard now story in the historical literature. There's a kind of dissenting view on it, which is to say that, in fact, the Cold War was not a good thing for civil rights, because, in fact, the Cold War meant that a lot of more radical left and communist-affiliated black people and black institutions came under fire during the Cold War and were actually inhibited from helping with the civil rights struggle. So, I don't really take a position on that debate, except to say that, okay, between the sort of diplomats at the higher echelons of American power and the kind of grassroots mobilizations of militants, well, who's in between them? It's police. Police are the ones who are kind of tasked with, on the one hand, making sure that civil rights struggle doesn't turn into open rebellion, and on the other hand, they're also given the responsibility of figuring out how to negotiate the terms of this kind of emerging new political vocabulary around civil rights on a kind of global scale. And so I found it in my research, what I found to be so interesting was that just as you had these kind of liberal intellectuals who are kind of crafting this notion of Cold War civil rights, or we might call it racial liberalism on a global scale, which is to say, again, we're going to be very cautious about allowing the US to be seen as a racist country that is founded on white supremacy. We're going to try to do our best to moderate this kind of global, the global reception of the United States. So that is not the first impression that people get. In addition to these intellectuals and diplomats who are thinking through that problem, you also have police thinking through that problem. And I think this struck me as seemingly contradictory, because I think, you know, a lot of people would say, oh, well, when I think of police, say in the 1950s, I think of police as the sort of enforcers of Jim Crow, the enforcers of controls on labor radicals, the enforcers, you know, of segregation and so forth. So to find that actually police are writing pamphlets that are being circulated alongside the kind of canonical text of post-World War II racial liberalism, you know, made me pause and say, okay, well, something peculiar is going on here, and how do I make sense of this? And so, one way to make sense of it is to say that the police who are tasked with assuring order on a global scale and training and equipping police in other countries, they had to reframe their own ideas, and they had to rethink their vocabulary, and they had to be very cautious about using some of the kind of bigoted language that some of their colleagues back home might have used. And part of the reason that they had to do that was because the officers that they're training in other countries, who mostly are of darker skin tones than they are, because they're mostly white, almost all, some of them are Latino, but they're almost all white. These officers are saying to them, like, we know that cops in the United States are racist. Are you going to treat us as your racial inferiors? And they're like, no, we're not. Now, whether we believe them or not is a somewhat separate question, you know, in terms of their sincerity. And of course, the old attitudes always kind of bubble to the surface and kind of slip out. But on an institutional level, they were charged with, not being bigoted towards these cops in other countries who they're tasked with training and kind of giving new technical skills to. And of course, one of the great challenges, this has always been the challenge for U.S. empire, or even empires more broadly, is if people are going to go to far-off lands with the idea of, I'm going to impart my know-how and my sort of technical abilities to people on the ground in these other places, the question that is always in the back of these people's heads is, are they actually capable of receiving the lessons that I'm giving them? And that is how these racial attitudes never quite really go away. Because there's always a certain question of, like, are these police in third world countries, are they up to the task of learning US-style methods, and some of those are sometimes complicated, forensic and scientific methods. There's always this kind of question and lingering in the back of these experts' minds, like, do these people on the ground in these countries, do they really have the ability to learn what we're trying to teach them? Well, of course they did, but that skepticism never is totally eradicated, and that's one of the kind of fundamental kind of challenges or conundrums that racial liberalism itself can never quite get out of.
Yeah, thank you. You used the phrase U.S. empire, which I want to talk about, especially in light of this book taking place in the era of decolonization. You're making an argument that, in fact, police assistance is an imperial project. So I'd like you to tell us about police assistance itself as a project. What is it? How did it take place? Who were some of the key figures? And why was police assistance, as opposed to maybe some other technique, such a key modality of empire? And then tell us how that fits into your conceptualization of the U.S. as an empire.
Sure. So, I guess I'll take the first part first, which is what did this police assistance look like? So it had basically three components. As I said, technical assistance. And all of U.S. development aid after World War II always had a technical assistance component. What that means is that experts go to other countries and they try to give both the kind of implements that are necessary for the development task and the kind of know-how in using those implements. So, you know, the most kind of stereotypical development project is a dam. So the idea is we're going to bring people who are kind of experts on hydrology and on construction, and the dam will be constructed oftentimes with local labor. They're not going to bring a whole bunch of US construction workers to, you know, name your country, wherever. That would be way too expensive. They're going to use local labor. But that local labor is going to be guided by the kind of know-how and expertise of US well-trained professionals. So the same is true for policing. The United States is going to rely on the police of these countries, but it's going to impart US kind of know-how and technical skills to them, help them build up certain capacities that they need, ranging from plans for how to direct traffic and, you know, kind of make traffic flow more smooth in cities, which is a kind of very basic, almost, you know, it's the kind of thing that police are involved with that we tend not to even think about, to the more kind of highly technical surveillance type apparatuses that police would learn how to use high technology, the kind of most up-to-date technology of surveillance and other things like that. So technical assistance is one component. The next component is training. So 52 countries get technical assistance, but 77 countries during the post-World War II to the mid-70s, 77 countries send trainees to the United States. And mostly these are not kind of patrol-level police. They're kind of mid-level and higher-ranking police, with the idea is that these people are going to be the ones who are going to staff the training facilities back home. So you train the trainers, that was the kind of motto. So over 10,000 police from other countries came to the United States for training, and the training facility, which we can talk more about, was in Washington, D.C. And then the third component, the most expensive component, was the equipping of police with all sorts of the materials that they would need, ranging from the most banal, you know, uniforms, even badges, to handcuffs, to guns, to jeeps and motorcycles and other types. So, you know, that got to be somewhat expensive. You know, sending a couple of advisors to train people in a country on how to use police radios was not very expensive. But then equipping the police in those countries with thousands of radios, that got to be more expensive. But even still, the police assistance program was pretty cheap. And this was one of the reasons it was so popular, particularly with the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, because it was seen as a kind of cost saver in comparison to military assistance, which was very expensive, and then even other forms of development aid, which could get expensive. There's always these kinds, in the documents I looked at, there's, you know, always these kind of reminders like, hey, we get a lot of, you know, bang for the buck. Maybe I shouldn't use that phrase, but we get a lot of bang for the buck with police assistance. So, so how do I argue that this is a component of, or even essential to U.S. empire? Well, one part is just the sheer size of it. 52 countries. That's a lot of countries across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Military assistance is given to a lot of other countries, but military assistance, just so you kind of understand, military assistance is generally geared toward, not exclusively, but generally geared toward interstate combat. So it's like, you know, the United States is going to give, say, Brazil, you know, airplanes and ships. There's, I think of Brazil because there's a Brazilian ship in the Harvard in Baltimore that I just saw, which is like really weird. I was thinking like people should be like protesting Bolsonaro in front of this shit, but anyway, I didn't do it. I just looked at it. Anyway, so but yeah, like the U.S. is giving military assistance to countries to make sure that they can kind of face external aggression. You know, this is the phrase that they would use. Now, at the same time, during the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, the real worry of the United States is not so much that countries are going to be facing external aggression. They're going to be facing internal aggression. They're going to be facing internal destabilization, political movements that are going to destabilize governments from the left. And so the idea is that police are going to be the phrase that they always use, that I repeat throughout the book. The police are going to be the first line of defense against these kind of movements that are potentially going to destabilize governments. So I think that it, you know, and you know, we can have an argument or a conversation or an agreement about this. You know, some might not agree with my use of the term empire, but I think that the term empire is warranted. Not because the United States replicates what, say, the UK or France did, but in fact because it learns from what they did, and it tries to do something slightly different. So some of my colleagues at Johns Hopkins University are like, we don't use the term empire, we use the term hegemony. And I'm fine with that. That after World War II, the United States becomes the hegemon on a global scale. But I do think that if we're able to be flexible and understand that empire is kind of a moving target, that it's kind of changing with each shifting hegemony, then the term is perhaps warranted. And I think that the United States certainly does take colonies in the first part of the 20th century, and of course maintains some colonies up to the present, most notably Puerto Rico. But generally, unlike the French or British empires, the United States is not going to take empire, it's not going to take colonies. It's going to create these kind of bilateral agreements with mostly sovereign states and say, we're going to give you technical assistance, development aid, and so forth, but what we want in return is loyalty. What we want in return is economic access to resources. We want you to buy our consumer goods and our industrial durable goods and so forth. These bilateral agreements, of course, they're signed between, on paper, two equal parties, but no question they're not two equal parties. The United States is much more powerful than any of these signatories to these bilateral agreements, but they do nevertheless sign agreements, which is not the case, say, with France, taking a colony by force, or even the United States taking the colony of Puerto Rico by force. After World War II, there is at least a nominal, what's the word I want to use? Acquiescence, I guess. A nominal acquiescence to the sovereignty of other countries. And again, it's because there are these movements for independence that the United States does not want to further antagonize. It knows that if it's seen to be too politically overbearing, it might summon independence movements. So, the United States, the experts in the United States kind of diplomatic apparatus, they're basically right about this. Of course, Vietnam is the clearest example, but in other places as well, where the United States does introduce troops. Well, what happens, people get real pissed off and they respond in kind. The idea is that police assistance can kind of thread the needle. On the one hand, not summon too much resistance, and on the other hand, still make sure that these countries are going to be capitalist, they're going to remain allied with the United States, or at least not antagonistic towards U.S. power. So that's kind of how those two pieces work together.
Yeah, thank you. I feel like we're in the midst. You mentioned that your colleagues at Johns Hopkins are critical of the empire framework, and yet we're in the midst of a kind of a renaissance of thinking about U.S. empire, and I feel like this book is a really important part of it. You mentioned threats from within and the New Left, and I wanted you to talk a little bit about leftist movements in the United States, both as really important elements that sort of identified what was happening as it was happening, right, in terms of the circulation of sort of repressive technologies, but also as sort of targets of these techniques, right, because the argument makes, your book makes the argument that not only do these ideas circulate outward, but they circulate back with what Foucault called the boomerang effect. So if you could talk a little bit about movements from within as a catalyst for the repatriation of these technologies, or the circulation of them, as well as the way in which they were able to diagnose these movements. So for instance, on page 3, you cite Bobby Seale, who talks about the racist military police force occupying our communities just like the foreign American troops in Vietnam. And I think we've heard things like this before, but your book really demonstrates that this isn't hyperbole, that this is an actual diagnosis of what's taking place.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I tried to, in some sense, take really seriously a lot of those critiques from figures like Seale. I mean, you know, there's a whole number of radicals from that era who kind of use similar language. And in some sense, you know, my purpose in writing the book, or my kind of inspiration in writing the book, was to take that seriously. And I don't know that I've necessarily even advanced upon their analysis, but I at least have had access to declassified documents that they didn't see. So all I could do is just, you know, kind of go to the National Archives and say, like, you know, okay, 10,000 documents later, Bobby Seale was right. But yeah, I mean, I think that it was the case that a whole range of national security experts and social scientists. I mean, in the 1960s, the Pentagon, you know, turned on the faucet of money, and social scientists lined up, you know, to fill their cups. And so, well, what did the Pentagon want to know? The Pentagon wanted to know, okay, what's the threat overseas, and then what is the connection between the threat overseas and the threat at home. So a lot of social scientists went kind of looking for it, and perhaps even before, even in advance at points of where militants were at, social scientists were saying, look, what they're doing overseas, they're going to be doing at home. And so, you know, increasingly, and I kind of chart some of this language in the book, you find all of these phrases, whether it's in the hands of social scientists or members of Congress. I mean, I have a quote from one member of Congress who says something like, you know, the police have, I can't remember the exact quote, but, you know, the police understand our soldiers in Vietnam, because just like our soldiers in Vietnam, you know, they're dealing with an enemy who stalks from the shadows, like the Viet Cong, or, you know, whatever. There's quotes like that, you know, in the congressional record. They're all over the place. Social science literature of that period is all over the place. In the policing literature, and this is one of the things that I do in my book, is one of the kind of main research objects that I look at is the professional policing literature. So it's all over the place. You have these experts writing articles for, you know, aimed at police, who say, you know, look, the revolutionary situation exists in the rice paddies in Vietnam, and it exists in you know, the neighborhoods of our cities, like, you know, Washington or Los Angeles or whatever. You know, they're constantly making these analogies, and then they're building a security apparatus that is constructed in such a way to use the same techniques in both places. So that's kind of what I trace, and And I guess like, one kind of twist that I wasn't totally anticipating going into this is that the police training overseas, these countries, these new nations overseas, oftentimes the governments are pretty weak, they're fragile, they don't have a lot of popular legitimacy, they've often come out of a very contentious political contestation and through movement contestation. So the United States is trying to upgrade their technical capacities. And one of the things that the United States is very aware of is that in addition to kind of upgrading their ability to maintain order, the best way to make sure that order is, that order is maintained is for these governments to be legitimate. So how do you make a government legitimate? Well, you make it seem like it's not that repressive. But it's, again, kind of a paradox that you would use police agencies to give the impression that governments aren't that repressive. So one of the things that I found in how do they do this? Well, what do they say, look, if you want your government to seem repressive, go shoot a crowd down in the street. Well, they don't actually put it that way. But that is the surest way to make your government seem illegitimate. When a crowd protests about something that they're unhappy about, if you kill them. And of course, we're seeing this in lots of places as we speak, in Iraq, in Chile, and other places. So they say, okay, don't shoot them. Instead, find less lethal, non-lethal ways to maintain order. And so the US government introduces tear gas, and specifically a kind of more powerful chemical than was commonly used at the time, which is called CS, which is now very commonly used. But at the time in the 60s, it was not very commonly used. So they introduced CS as a crowd control technology instead of firing guns into crowds. This is what throughout the 60s, this is the advice they give to countries around the globe, again, with the idea that it will help them maintain legitimacy. From 64 to 67 in the United States, there's civil unrest, civil disturbances in the kind of terms of the time in many, many cities across the United States. And oftentimes, not only are these events spurred by police violence, like say in Watts, in Newark, these kind of what people see as racist incidents of police violence or brutality. Not only are they spurred by police activity, but then they're worsened by the police response to protest. Police oftentimes just shoot people down in the street, or they fire their guns kind of wildly at houses, at housing projects, and so forth. So by 1967, the Johnson administration is like, all right, this approach is clearly not working. The police are just making things worse with their own actions. Who do we know who has an idea for how we can actually bolster the legitimacy of governments in America's cities, which oftentimes are, because of existing racial inequality, oftentimes these governments are not legitimate, particularly in some parts of the city. Who do we know who can give good advice about this? Well, it seems like the person who can give the best advice about this is the guy who's in charge of the police assistance program overseas, whose name is Byron Engel. So Byron Engel gets invited to testify before the Kerner Commission in October of 1967, and his advice is, use tear gas instead of firing your guns at crowds. Seems relatively obvious, but somebody had to say it. It had to get, kind of entered into the official record, and then it had to get put into the Kerner Commission's report. The Kerner Commission basically quotes Byron Engel verbatim. And I say this at the outset of the book. So the Kerner Commission report comes out in February of 1968. In fact, I think it came out on February 29th, which is a little weird because there isn't always a 29th of February. I was like, what day did it come out on it anyway? So like, all these weird, when you write a book, these like bizarre details are the things that keep you up at night. So the report comes out, and the report spurs great investment on the part of Washington through the Department of Justice, eventually through the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, which comes into existence a few months later, through the Department of Defense and other agencies. And this investment, a lot of it goes into putting tear gas, and specifically CS, in the hands of police, National Guard around the country. And again, the argument for why to do that is that police have actually just been too brutal and too violent, and they've made these incidents of protest and mass demonstration turn into riots because of their brutality. And the lesson about avoiding that kind of incitement comes from the US experience overseas, where again, they're trying to manage this very delicate situation of these governments with low levels of legitimacy, low levels of state capacity, a lot of political vendettas on the ground, and so forth. So that that lesson is fairly easily transferred back home.
Yeah, thank you. So some folks might hear this sort of substitution of tear gas for more explicitly violent means and say, well, that seems like a good thing, a step in the right direction, right? So I'm not asking you to make a moral or ethical judgment, but what I do want to ask you to do is to put that decision-making calculus within the context of counterinsurgency and pacification, which is what you do in the book. Yeah.
What do you want me to say?
I want you to talk about policing as pacification.
Okay. Well, I guess I should say one thing, which is that yes, it's true that the application of tear gas doesn't kill people the way that firing guns into crowds kills people. On the other hand, if it were only the case that tear gas were used on crowds, maybe we could say, okay, this is an improvement. But what I show in the book is that tear gas, once it's introduced on this and put in the hands, this very strong form of tear gas, CS, is put in the hands of lots and lots of police all over the country. Well, guess what? They don't only use it in crowd control situations. They talk about it as a crowd control technology, but they end up using it in a wide variety of settings that have nothing to do with crowd control, oftentimes to force people out of enclosed spaces. And this is another kind of lesson that they take directly from Vietnam, where CS is used in unheard of quantities in Vietnam. Mostly, the problem of guerrilla warfare, or countering guerrilla warfare, is always how do you find the guerrillas? Well, one way to find them is to put a chemical on them that makes it so that they can't breathe, and they run trying to find a place where they can get oxygen. Well, in Vietnam, that meant that US or South Vietnamese soldiers would either capture them if they were feeling charitable, or most likely just shoot them when they came out into the open. Well, guess what? The same thing happens with policing in the United States. You saw police shooting tear gas into buildings where people were hiding, and then when people flee because they're choking to death, police would shoot them down. So yes, on the one hand, this is a less lethal technology. On the other hand, it's not used in a less lethal way, particularly going into the 70s and even up to the present.
If I could just add before you answer the other question, in my research I've found that tear gas is increasingly used as just a strategy of punishment in prisons, where people can't actually flee at all.
Yep.
And so it just sort of reinforces your point that once these technologies are introduced, they then become refashioned in ways that maybe weren't expected initially.
Yeah.
But yeah, if you could talk a little bit about your, so like we talked about earlier, there's this sort of really narrow conception of policing as, a really discrete institutional formation that sort of preserves order in a very particular way, but you're actually making a much broader argument about policing and what police can do, both in terms of how they change relations within the state, within the government, but also how they have a whole series of sort of productive capacities.
Yeah.
You could talk a little about that.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm inspired by a range of newish kind of political theory that is making arguments about how the institutions that we call police are not merely kind of repressive, but they also are kind of productive in that they kind of shape social behaviors, and they even kind of shape, or to use the word of one theorist, they fabricate social order. That social order doesn't just kind of exist before the introduction of police, but police kind of make it come into being. And what does social order mean? Well, social order means a certain set of capitalist social relations and property relations, and then we could add on to that race and gender relations and so forth. So how does this work? Well, again, I mentioned traffic. I mean, I think that traffic control is one of kind of the most fundamental things where police are very concerned with, all of us know, police are concerned with, when you violate traffic laws, you run a red light or you're speeding or whatever. But they also know that they can't possibly, stop every person who runs a red light or every person who's speeding. What they try to do is get you to internalize the notion that I shouldn't be speeding, I shouldn't run a red light, on the one hand because it's dangerous, of course, but on the other hand because I might get caught and I might, face a fine or whatever. And so I think just like in the most basic way, like one of the things that the US is trying to do in other countries is get it so that police don't have to respond to every kind of incident, but that the social order that police are meant to maintain will kind of run semi-autonomously without kind of active police intervention at every moment. And the idea is basically where the notion of pacification comes in. I mean, pacification is a term that is used by a lot of these counterinsurgency theorists in the 50s, 60s, into the 70s. And the idea behind pacification is basically that the people who are the sort of objects of it are going to be responsible for their own security and their own kind of development and uplift. They're going to engage in sort of self-help. Again, there's going to be technical assistance provided by the United States or development agencies, but ultimately they're going to do the work themselves. And the self-defense portion comes in most explicitly in places like Vietnam, where you kind of see the US constructing these volunteer, but they're not really volunteer forces of people in villages that are responsible for the security of the village. And then those people are also kind of responsible for doing a lot of the development activity. And the idea behind the development activity is that the communists might offer them a better set of options. So the US has to try to improve their lives, or the communists are going to offer a better life to them, and the US won't be able to compete. So the US is proactive in saying, we're going to help improve your lives, we're going to help your crop yields improve, we're going to improve your sanitation, we're going to improve your health, we're going to give you the tools to build a school, we're going to give you textbooks for you to teach your kids in the school. We're not necessarily going to do the teaching ourselves, you're going to do the work, but we're going to give you the kind of implements. And so pacification kind of is aimed at this whole wide population, on the one hand to kind of give it a certain level of developmental uplift, but on the other hand to kind of immunize it against the subversive voices that are always kind of like looming just beyond the edge of the village or whatever. I mean, that's in the conception. The subversive propaganda will not have any effect if these people's lives are being improved and they're invested in their own improvement through this kind of self-help. If they build their own house, if they build their own village, if they build their own school, and then some communist guerrillas come and blow it up, well, then they're going to be really pissed off with the communist guerrillas. Of course, the reality was, at least in South Vietnam, well, it wasn't usually the guerrillas who were blowing it up, it was U.S. airstrikes, so it didn't work. But this is the idea behind pacification, and police are central to this because on the one hand, they're going to arrest people who say, hey, I don't want to do that work. I want to just live my life, leave me alone. Well, the police are going to arrest them, and the police have been equipped by and trained by the U.S. to carry out that task.
So Washington, D.C. plays a really key role in the book, right? It's the location of the International Police Academy, where these police from these different countries come to D.C. To engage in this process of technical and intellectual organizational development and assistance. Can you talk about the significance of D.C. And how folks that came here, the sort of gender and racial politics of bringing this wide variety of people from the third world to the United States and specifically to DC?
Sure. So when the police assistance program kind of first gets off the ground in the 1950s, there is no centralized training facility to bring officers from other countries to the United States. Some of them go to various colleges and universities. A lot of them basically just go to station houses around the country, and they basically, do ride-alongs. And what's very interesting is that a lot of these officers are really high-ranking police in their home countries. They're some of the most high-ranking police in their home countries. And then they get set up to do a ride-along with like a patrol officer in, Spokane or whatever, no offense to Spokane. But, and they're like, what am I doing here? Like this, this is not all that interesting. So maybe, in some cases they like shacked up with like a local paramour for some excitement. So, you can imagine there were a lot of problems with this program of sending high-ranking cops from other countries all across the United States. So basically the CIA, the National Security Council, and others basically say, all right, this isn't working. We need a more kind of centralized location to bring all of these police to, where there's going to be a more standardized curriculum, and even a more kind of guaranteed indoctrination into both U.S. ideas and values and the kind of technical training we want them to receive. So they kind of go back and forth, all right, where should it be, where should it be, where should it be? And they eventually decide, well, it has to be in a majority black city, because so many of these police officers from around the globe are dark-skinned. And this is in 62 or so, before the Civil Rights Act. Segregation, in 1962, some people thought segregation was on its way out, but nobody was certain that segregation was on its way out. So if the fear was, if we bring, say, a cop from Nigeria or Ghana or Ethiopia to some city in the South, they're going to experience bigotry, and that will just kind of raise the whole panoply of questions that I spoke about earlier. So they say, all right, let's do it in a majority black city, and it just also happens that if we do it in Washington, D.C., well, then we have close access to the intelligence agencies and various other important agencies that we might need access to. So some of you may know in Georgetown, the car barn, which is at the end of the Key Bridge, the building still exists to this day. It's now mostly occupied by Georgetown University under a lease. I think it's owned privately. But the International Police Academy is set up there around 63, and it lasts until 1975. And it's basically, they build the kind of most state-of-the-art police academy anywhere in the world in that building. It has a state-of-the-art gun range, and that in itself is really interesting, because again, these are high-ranking officers for the most part. The chances that they're ever going to need to fire their gun are very, very slim, except if there's a coup, which, you know, did happen. But, you know, generally, the idea, again, was training trainers. So it's like, okay, we're going to teach you how to have the best marksmanship training so that you can go back home to your countries and have great marksmanship training. But also, they just have a lot, you know, they have a lot of classrooms. I mean, they have rooms like this, where it would basically be like this. You know, you'd have, like, probably an English-speaking officer, a translator, and then, you know, officers. Classes were either in French or Spanish, English, maybe a little Portuguese. The translator would oftentimes, I mean, I found this one great quote, which I don't think actually even made it into the book, but this quote where this translator is like, he's like, you know, he's telling a joke, I don't know how to translate it, it's not even really funny, but just like when he's done, laugh. So that was kind of like the tenor of a lot of it. But certainly these police who are coming over from other countries are getting vetted as assets for the US intelligence agencies. Are they trustworthy? Are they reliable? And the US is also trying to learn about about these countries' kind of broader political and social situations. In order to graduate from the training academy, each trainee had to write a thesis. And this came to be this came to be something that I think the CIA and NSC and various other, you know, acronym agencies regretted forcing them to all write these theses. And the reason is some of them were extremely banal. They would be like, I'm a police officer, I came to the United States, I learned how to be a better police officer, thank you, John F. Kennedy, for allowing me this, you know, whatever. It was like, you know, wouldn't really fly in a college classroom. But some of them were quite detailed analyses of policing. They had a library in this facility, which I don't know what happened to the library. I fear that we'll never find out. And maybe all the volumes were destroyed. But it was probably like the most comprehensive and multilingual library about policing in the entire world at the time. Maybe Harvard's is better, but you know, whatever. It was up there. So they had access to research resources, and they wrote these theses. Well, lo and behold, some of the theses advocated things like torture, and that eventually came to light in a kind of public scandal that we can talk about in a minute. But the other thing that happened is that this police academy became a setting for a sort of cultural diplomacy. So what I found, what was so interesting, is that like all of the pictures of the academy, and the United States would kind of send these brochures, just the same way that like any of you who got a brochure trying to convince you to attend, you know, Johns Hopkins University or whatever, you got a brochure and it showed all these smiling students of, you know, differing backgrounds. Well, the police academy, the International Police Academy did the same thing. You get these pictures of these smiling police officers that kind of look like a Benetton ad of policing. I guess you're too young to know what a Benetton ad is. So, you know, whatever. It's a kind of multicultural vision of these police. And then they would have these parties, kind of like monthly parties, where various people would sing their kind of national anthems, or like if it was like a holiday back home, they would kind of say like, this is how we celebrate our holiday back home. This is the cuisine we would eat back home. So it became this like kind of cultural, a space for sharing kind of cultural traditions among cops from different countries, under the whole idea that the United States was facilitating the sharing. And then they would print these brochures that would have pictures of the parties, and you'd have these dark-skinned cops from around the globe dancing with white women, and they would be put in these brochures, these photos. And I don't really talk about this in the book, but it's really interesting, again, because this is still segregation. You know, DC is segregated. You know, I mean, it's still segregated, but it's at the time, it was at the kind of cutting edge of what was I think, acceptable, certainly among police audiences, to see these kind of interracial dances and stuff. So there's something very interesting happening kind of ideologically, in addition to all the kind of technical and technological training that's going on at the International Police Academy in Georgetown. And there were other facilities, sometimes if they needed more specialized training, they would go to other facilities. And then there was a secret CIA facility, I can't remember what street it was on, but that they would send some people to. And we don't really know very much about that secret CIA facility. It was called International Police Services. There's basically no archival documents available about it that I've ever seen. But yeah, so that's the DC component of the story. Also, lots of these public safety advisors who go overseas, when they come back home, they retire to the DC, Maryland area. And some of them then go on to become cops or private investigators or various other security actors in this region.
Yeah, you have this really, I mean, I'm into methods, so I gotta ask a methods question. But you have this really, I find, fascinating depiction in your book about the National Archives, which is also local, so I think we should talk about that. So tell us a little bit about how you put this book together and some of the challenges that you faced in attempting to weave together these two sides of the story, which are quite fundamental, but which up to now have been described relatively separately.
Yeah.
And I think that that's not an accident, and you figured out how to sort of overcome that. I wanted to hear a little bit about that.
Thanks. I mean, I try to overcome it. One thing is to say that I just, in a sense, I just tried to kind of put an emphasis on, and it's like what other people would have put in the footnotes, I put in the main text, if that makes sense. Other people might write about some of the figures I look at, say like Byron Engel, who's a figure I spent a long time in the book on. They might say like, well, Byron Engel did all this stuff overseas, and in the footnote, he was a cop in Kansas City before he went overseas. So I was like, okay, well, I need to figure out what was happening in Kansas City and how does that explain what he did in his career overseas. So I went to Kansas City. I'd been there once before, but I really knew nothing about Kansas City. And so then I kind of had to learn a whole bunch about Kansas City, and then even spreading out beyond Kansas City. Okay, Byron Engel knows a whole bunch of police from other cities in the Midwest. What's up with that? Why is there this kind of network of police experts in the Midwest? In Kansas, in Missouri, Michigan, Iowa, how does that network come into being? What are its effects? So, and then how did I do that work? I mean, in some sense, it was like, the thing I always say about going to the National Archives, and maybe some of you have been to the National Archives, when you walk in College Park, when you walk in, you have to go to a room. And the room is kind of divided in half. On the left side of the room are the civilian agencies of the federal government, and on the right side of the room are the military agencies of the federal government. And you talk to two different sets of archivists, you look at two different colored binders to kind of like find your way toward whatever files you're looking at. And so, I was thinking, all right, I'm interested in a process that is neither fully civilian nor fully military, but is somewhere kind of in between. Well, who do I ask? Who do I talk to? You can't just go in and say, like, I want to see what's kind of in the interstices between the two. It just doesn't work that way. So what it meant was, I went down a lot of dead ends, paths that led to dead ends that were frustrating. And I think that anybody who's engaging in research, I would say that you have to be prepared for that. Research oftentimes is frustrating. But I would kind of try to look on both sides of this divide, both sides of the foreign-domestic divide, both sides of this civilian-military divide. And if I found a name that seemed to appear on either side, then I would say, okay, that person must be important, and I need to figure out who that person is, why are they appearing in both of these places. And so it was almost like kind of, you know, making a list of names, figuring out who they are, figuring out what about their career enables them to kind of cross these divides. And so I think I did do the research first through kind of personnel and then through institutions. I kind of like understood, okay, there are these institutions that enable them to kind of travel across these divides. So how do I characterize the institutions? And then I found that these people, such as Byron Engel and others, they are institution builders. So they're creating the institutions that allow them to do that travel across the divides. So, you know, I mean, Engel's agency is the Office of Public Safety. The Office of Public Safety left behind records that I could access. They're incomplete in some ways, in part because the files about the International Police Academy were destroyed in violation of federal law. But most of the files are there. So I was able to kind of, you know, use them, and they're not that interesting. You know, I mean, I'm like obsessed with them, but they're not interesting. And that's another thing about doing historical research. It's like, how do you tell an interesting story about boring documents? I hope I've succeeded, but you know, especially Byron Engel, I don't think the man ever used an adjective. Like, he's the least interesting writer I've ever read. So, and yet I have to quote him over and over and over again. Some of the other people I quote a lot are more interesting writers. So you kind of like savor, anytime they say something interesting, you savor it. But that in itself, you know, it's like the boringness and the banality of it all, I think hides what's actually going on here. And I tried to also take that seriously. You know, again, the US Empire, it's not to say that we shouldn't take really seriously, both in kind of political and ethical terms, the spectacular abuses that we associate with US power overseas. But part of the point of the book is to also take seriously the kind of mundane and less spectacular aspects that are beneath the surface. It's not to say that the, you know, thousands of bombs dropped from, you know, jets over South Vietnam are not worthy of study. But that's just not my project. My project is to say, okay, well, what is happening in a complementary fashion at the very same time that is just, you know, less kind of spectacular and much more mundane and affecting people's everyday lives across the globe as well as at home. So that's what I try to pull out. So in some sense, I try to use boring documents to tell an exciting story about the boringness of everyday life.
Well said, well said. I have two questions, remaining questions for you, and then I would love to open it up. One is I wanted you to talk about how the police assistance program comes to an end.
Sure.
And then also the caveat for the ending of that program, right? Like, so it comes to an end, but yeah.
Okay. So, all right. So as I said, these theses that these police officers from other countries wrote and deposited in the library at the International Police Academy, I never found a document saying this explicitly, but my sense is that the only people who really read them, in addition to the advisors whose job was to give them a grade, basically. Other than that, I think CIA intelligence analysts read them, and they kind of like hoovered whatever info they could out of them. I should, maybe I should. So they were meant to just kind of become artifacts for US intelligence gathering. Somewhere along the way, the Senate, US Senate, finds out that these theses exist. And the story of how that basically comes to be is that there are New Left activists, mostly initially affiliated with the North American Congress on Latin America, but then also the Institute for Policy Studies, both of which still exist to this day. These activists are concerned with US empire and how it works, and they are becoming aware of what the Office of Public Safety is doing overseas. In part, they're becoming aware because there are people who are coming back from other countries who are development actors who are saying, you know, I went to the Dominican Republic or wherever to, you know, help bring irrigation to rural villages. And everywhere I went, there was this public safety advisor who was always trying to find out, okay, what are the police in that village up to? So they basically became disgruntled with this experience. At the same time, the left, the international left, sometimes affiliated with communist governments, they themselves have an intelligence apparatus, and they know what the U.S. is doing in other countries. So there's a kind of there's a bit of the New Left activists are kind of getting information from people who are like them, who are American, young Americans who are kind of disillusioned with what the U.S. is doing overseas, and they're also getting some tip-offs from, you know, say Cuba or whatever. Of course, the U.S. Congress and certainly conservatives are saying this is all just propaganda coming out of Cuba, but it's not exclusively. These activists, basically, they just start collecting U.S. government documents, which you can get in lots of libraries, because the public safety program is listed as a budget line in the USAID budget. So they say, okay, what are the documents that we can access freely? What do they say? There are also congressional hearings where the Office of Public Safety is talked about. So the information is not secret, but the New Left activists put a kind of finer point on it. And they say, okay, look, this is actually an instrument of repression in these other countries, that the US is creating an instrument of repression in other countries. There are a couple scandals that happen. One in South Vietnam, where it turns out that there's a prison in South Vietnam that is holding teenagers, women, girls, as well as men in these absolutely terrible conditions. That becomes a scandal. It makes it to the pages of Life magazine.
Can you tell us a little bit about the person who's responsible for that? Wasn't there one of the people responsible for that was also a prison
Oh, yeah.
official
Oh,
in the
sure,
United
sure.
States? Yeah.
Yeah, so the prison advising in South Vietnam is basically overseen by two guys. One is an former LAPD officer who's, again, a relatively famous cop in professional circles of policing in the 50s into the 60s. And the other is a former prison guard in, I believe, San Quentin, who goes to South Vietnam and is responsible for this prison where these people are being held in these terrible conditions. Congress people themselves discover these terrible conditions. They're sort of tipped off by a volunteer, but they see it with their own eyes. And then they come back and write a report, and then the official report basically minimizes the horrible conditions that they witnessed. So then they go to the press with it. So that's a scandal. Another scandal is that one of these public safety advisors in Uruguay gets kidnapped and assassinated. That makes the news. So activists start working with Congress and they say, we got to figure out what's going on with the Office of Public Safety and with the International Police Academy. So there's a senator from South Dakota who's one of the kind of most left-leaning senators at the time named James Aberest. The first and perhaps only Lebanese-American senator, and he was only in for one term. He sends his staffers, including a guy named Tom Daschle, who some of you may know that name. They go to the International Police Academy, and they say, hey, what's going on here, guys? And the public safety advisors are like, oh yeah, well, we'll tell you what we do. We train. Come see our classroom. Come see our, whatever. This is our list of courses. They go to the library, and the Senate staffers say, well, what are all these, books on the shelves? And they say, oh, those are the theses that the trainees write. And they say, can we read them? And they're like, okay, we can't really stop Congress from reading them. They read them and they find out that they advocate torture and so forth. This gets, read into the congressional record. And so the New Left feeds a lot of information to Congress that Congress then uses its own investigative powers to find more information about. At the same time, there start to be street protests outside of the International Police Academy. I saw in one place that somebody set off a bomb outside it. I can't confirm that that's true. So there was like a wide range of kind of protest tactics against it. There's graffiti written on it. Y'all know the Exorcist, the famous Exorcist steps are right next to the car barn in Georgetown. If you look at the very last scene, or maybe it's the second to last scene of The Exorcist where the guy tumbles down the steps and dies, if you pause it, there's like one moment where you can pause it and you can see the graffiti on the wall that is like against the International Police Academy. It says something about pigs or I don't know. So there's a wide range of protests. Congress gets involved, and eventually Aberesk, the senator, writes a new law that says the United States can no longer offer police assistance to other countries around the globe. And that passes, so in 1974, the Office of Public Safety gets shut down. Then they realize that this law says, well, it can't do it overseas, but there still is this training academy in DC, so they need to add another line to the law the next year that says, and they can't do it at home either. So that closes down the International Police Academy. But there are some loopholes that get written into the law. And this is how, on the one hand, this is a great success for the left, for the peace movement, in terms of getting this specific program shut down. But also they're somewhat outmaneuvered. And the activists, I found the correspondence from the activists where they write to Aberesk. This woman, Nancy Stein, who's an incredible activist at the time, she writes this letter after the law comes, is put on the books, and she writes him this letter and she says, dude, what's up? Not in those exact terms. There's a loophole in the law. And he's like, look, I had to get this legislation through Congress. Like, I'm sorry there's a loophole, but I did the best I could. So the loophole basically says, it's like the United States can no longer offer police assistance to other countries around the globe, except under certain circumstances. And among those circumstances are narcotics control. And narcotics control, as you know, becomes a massive, it's already a big endeavor even before 1975, but after 75 it becomes a massive endeavor. And so under the auspices of the DEA, as many officers in other countries get trained by the US government as had been trained by the Office of Public Safety. The difference is that they're trained nominally only in narcotics control, whereas the training that the Office of Public Safety offered was in the whole gamut of policing. And obviously narcotics control is never just narcotics control, it also has a political component, and so that's one of the ways that the kind of counterinsurgency mission continues into the 70s, 80s, 90s, up to the present. So there's a loophole, which is, I think, really important to know about, and also the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, which is the kind of federal apparatus that's built up to run the war on crime, which means it's giving money for policing and prisons and courts to states and municipalities. It also has its enabling legislation changed around this time where it gets us sort of global purview as well. The effort to rewrite that law, there's some investigations in Congress. They say, how much money is it going to cost the LEAA if we kind of change its operating procedures so it has a global purview? I don't know, let's go ask the Office of Public Safety. Right? So it's like the Office of Public Safety is about to get shut down, but they're looking at it for a kind of model for how much money they might need to spend for LEAA kind of interacting overseas. It doesn't actually end up doing what ODS had been doing. That law is still on the books. There is, to this day, no single office or agency of the US government that is tasked with training police in other countries. Instead, basically every agency in this town trains police overseas. DOJ, DHS, DOD, state. They all do it. And then there's also a whole bunch of private corporations that do it. The private corporations kind of emerged in the 1970s, and they emerged directly out of the closure of the Office of Public Safety. Some of these guys who are overseas working as public safety advisors, they get the memo from Washington that says, guess what, we're out of business, come back home. And they say, I'm not coming back home, I'm staying right where I am. I'm going to incorporate a private corporation, and rather than the training, the funding for training going through, being funneled from the US government or whatever, I will just get a paycheck from this country and it'll come directly into my pocket. I'll keep doing the same work I've been doing, but now I will be, running a corporation called, like Police Training Inc. or whatever. Those corporations, of course, exist to this day. They make tons of money, in Afghanistan. DynCorp trained police for something like 6 years, and it was over $1 billion that they earned, which is, not chump change for one corporation in one country. They were ultimately deemed to have not done a good job. So then other US agencies got involved, and that kind of cycle has continued in many places. So police assistance was both shut down and totally transformed in the mid-70s. And my book ends in the mid-70s at that moment, but we can sort of talk more about the present if you'd like.
Yeah, my last question is for you to sort of reflect on how your findings, how you think your findings should inform sort of contemporary social movements, contemporary thinking and organizing that's attempting to challenge the carceral state, different forms of policing and or the national security state. And also would love for you to comment on how your work may or may not reframe the critique of militarized policing.
Yeah, that's a lot. I think that, first of all, the thing I would say is that the past is not the present. So, we shouldn't necessarily go looking to the past for lessons. On the other hand, I do think that there are some lessons to be drawn about the kind of political efforts that I just kind of laid out to you that got the Office of Public Safety shut down. Insofar as there were a range of tactics used, there were both kind of street protest tactics and activists doing educational programs by just kind of revealing the information that they had gathered, and they also worked with legislators. So any one of those on its own probably wouldn't have been effective. I think the other thing that one of the upshots of the book is just to say that we shouldn't be nostalgic for a kind of time in the past that was better, or more. Certainly in the contemporary moment, in the Trump moment, there's lots of people kind of lamenting the death of the liberal international order. The joke is it wasn't liberal, it wasn't international, it wasn't an order. But also it relied really heavily on policing. It relied really heavily on coercion, particularly in the third world. So we, and not only that, but the people who thought of themselves as the bearers of the liberal international order were these policing experts that I look at. They didn't see themselves as doing something totally separate from the project of US hegemony. They saw themselves as integral to it. So if that's the case, well then maybe we should, maybe we should pause before we lament the end of this putative liberal international order, because it had dimensions to it that many of us, I think, might find unsavory. I guess related to that is the notion that is kind of the question of reformism. I think that police are very happy to be told that they should reform themselves. That is not a critique that police are afraid of. They are happy to reform because what does reform mean? It means more resources. It means more training. It means that they will be taken seriously as being seen as more respectable and more legitimate because they will have engaged in reform efforts. So, I think that a lot of people on the liberal left side of the political spectrum, particularly after Ferguson, Baltimore, and so forth, the police killings that kind of became headlines in America and the movements that responded to them, a lot of people said, well, the solution here is reform. Police, certainly Obama himself said it, created a task force that was designed to outline what that reform should look like. There are rank and file police who didn't want to hear it. Those rank and file police, there's a kind of internal organizational battle within police, and this is something that my book kind of talks about that has existed for decades and decades and decades of kind of bottom-up resistance to top-down managerial impositions. Reform generally takes the shape of top-down managerial impositions, but you will not find any police chief or police executive or police expert who says, I don't want to reform police. They're all totally on board with that project because they see it as enhancing their legitimacy and enhancing their access to resources. So it raises the question of if a crisis emerges like the like the crisis of that now we refer to as kind of like the Black Lives Matter moment. We should not be at all surprised that in these crisis moments, the first people to say police should respond by reforming, by adopting new technologies, are police themselves. And so I think that just kind of like weakens, and this trend used in my book I show is really old. I think that weakens some of the power of those demands for reformism. Certainly it should weaken or it should give us some skepticism about the notion that technology is going to be the kind of magic solution to problems of police unfairness or various other problems. So.
But how does your work actually redirect the target of where the demands might even be issued or to whom they might be addressed? Right, so as opposed to
Yeah. Well, I guess like what I would say is just that we tend to think like police are the people whose station house is down the road and their uniforms say DC Metropolitan Police or whatever. So therefore we have to kind of talk to them in our locality. But I think what my book shows is that they're never penned into their own locality, their own jurisdiction. They're always kind of thinking beyond their jurisdiction. I mean, there are technical, bureaucratic, organizational reasons why they are attached to certain localities, but their vision of both problems to be solved and solutions to problems is always bigger than the jurisdiction that they're in. Excuse me. And so I think that just kind of makes it incumbent on us to kind of think big and think about developing political coalitions across space, across borders, and think really hard about what kind of on a material level those coalitions are going to look like. And that is a really hard question to answer. There's no easy answer to it. As soon as you think you have an easy answer, you're probably wrong. But I think we also should never be satisfied with the tendency to kind of scale things down to the lowest, localist scale. Police are happy to have it, happy to have their power only operate at the lowest scale because they always have more power at the lowest scale. But it's possible for political coalitions to kind of outflank that localized power, but it's very hard, challenging, complicated, frustrating work. I don't want to imply for a moment that that's not the case.
All right. Before we open it up for questions, is there any final thing that you'd like to say or something that I didn't ask?
No, I'd love to hear from all of you.
Yeah. So please join me in thanking Stuart for